Thank you all, and greetings to all of you. Good evening and good morning and good afternoon. I know you're all eagerly waiting to listen to Prof. Bromwich, so I should be brief, and I should never be in between Prof. Bromwich and you. And therefore, I just want to make a few remarks. It's a great challenge to introduce someone in the briefest time that I am allotted. So, as you all know, that Prof. Bromwich is a Sterling Professor of English at Yale University from 2006. And for your information, Sterling Professor, like University Professor in some other universities in the US, is offered to the best in the field. And also for your information, Sterling comes from John William Sterling, a great benefactor to Yale University. But I think Sterling as an adjective best describes the life, the work, and personality of David Bromwich. He is the best, undoubtedly, in this field. Professor Bromwich is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a trustee of the National Humanities Center in Research, Triangle Park in North Carolina, and a winner of Guggenheim Fellowship for Humanities, US and Canada. He is a frequent contributor to many reputed journals and publications all over the world. He has authored around 15 books, and the latest ones being Writing, Politics, and Anthology in 2020, American Breakdown, Trump Years and How They Befell Us in 2019. And his work in progress is Intellectual Biography of Burke. And he is one of the forceful thinkers working in America today. And he's also a great friend of St. Berchmans College and the Department of English. He visited the department in 2014 and gave the prestigious Shepard Memorial Lecture on the topic Romantic Sublime. All of us could experience his sterling qualities of his personality. And he visited St. Berchmans in the company of Professor Akhil Bilgrad. So I'm thankful to all of you. Professor Akhil, Professor Kalar is also attending today's program. So all of you are welcome to this gathering, and we are simply surprised by your generosity. And with these very few words, let me introduce and welcome Professor Bromwich to talk about his topic, John Keats, 1821 to 2021, Remarks and a Reading. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And I remember very warmly that visit to St. Berchmans College. It's now 7 years ago. And I hope to come back again someday. Travel is difficult these days. The earth that Keats wrote about is a different place because of climate circumstances, because of disease. But these are some of the pains that he talked about when he spoke of the necessity of struggling with a world of pains. So let us get on with honoring him today. I'm very appreciative of the invitation to address this audience on this occasion. It came as a surprise, but Keats thought many good things in life should come as a surprise, and that poetry should come as naturally as leaves to a tree. So I will mix some very well-known facts, but just as a reminder, with some readings of Keats's mainly poetry, but also prose, and then just stop whenever it seems to me that I ought to stop in order to leave half an hour or so for questions and exchanges with you who are watching and listening, as I arranged to do with Thomas Joseph when we spoke about this yesterday. So John Keats was born on October 31st, 1795, and died 200 years ago today. He is an improbable character to have become a poet, and part of the sentiment and affection for him that has been felt for readers in a more democratic age is owing to the fact that Keats was in no way an aristocratic person, but someone who, so to speak, rose to the stature of poetry by dedication, by accident, and by aspiration. His father was killed by a fall from a horse when John Keats was 8 years old. His mother brought up, whom he was devoted to, brought up the 4 children, but she herself died when John Keats was 13. He trained in medicine, became an apothecary's apprentice, and then an apothecary, something between what we would now call a pharmacist and a physician's assistant at Guy's Hospital in London. But in these years of his late adolescence, he was becoming absorbed with the reading and attempting to write poetry. His first poem was an imitation of Spenser, done at the age of 18 or so. And as he made acquaintance with literary figures in London who were publishing poems and prose that he admired, he was gradually taken up the way an aspiring musician in a garage band might be taken up, and fell in with the circle of Leigh Hunt, one of the most interesting literary characters of that age. And I thought for a first reading, I would give you Keats's sonnet on the grasshopper and cricket, written as sort of on a lark in a sonnet writing contest, when Keats, Hunt, and a third or fourth person who were with them heard the chirping of a cricket by the fireside, and Keats and Hunt were asked, "What a great topic for a poem! Why don't you try to each write one?" Nobody knows exactly how long this took, but I'm guessing half an hour or so. It is supposed to have been a very short time, considering the quality of what, on Keats's side anyway, was produced. And I'll share the screen so you can see the poem as I read it. This is a typical experimental, quickly run off piece by the very young Keats, age 21 or so. And see if I can get it. There we go. Can you all see that? It's visible?
Yeah.
The poem? Good.
Yes.
So I'll just read it. And the first line is of a kind with a thing of beauty is a joy forever, maybe even better. The poetry of earth is never dead. When all the birds are faint with the hot sun and hide in cooling trees, a voice will run from hedge to hedge about the new mown mead. That is the grasshopper's. He takes the lead in summer luxury. He has never done with his delights, for when tired out with fun, he rests at ease beneath some pleasant weed. The poetry of earth is ceasing never. On a lone winter evening, when the frost has wrought a silence, from the stove there shrills the cricket's song, in warmth increasing ever, and seems to one in drowsiness half lost, the grasshoppers among some grassy hills. Wonderful first line and last line. The speed at which he had to dash it off is maybe evident in one or two touches. No one speaking English then or now would use a locution like the poetry of earth is ceasing never. That present progressive tense is artificial. But look at what he's done with it. Sort of the payoff 4 lines below is increasing ever. So you get, more for your money on the rhyme. The other thing that struck me just reading this again recently for this occasion is the word fun. Fun is a low word. It's a very ordinary word. It's meant exactly the same thing in English from Keats's time to our own. But the dignity, the walking on stilts quality of elegant poetry would have rejected such a word as impossible. He just throws it in, and throws it in as applied to the grasshopper. The grasshopper is having fun. This is very characteristic, a very characteristic touch. And, what was admired at the time by their compatriots sitting beside them when Hunt and Keats shared their results was the phrase, lone winter evening when the frost has wrought a silence. And that is an extraordinary little detail of poetry. So there is the quality of what a critic of that age whom Keats admired, William Hazlitt, there's a quality of gusto in Keats's poetry, something tactile, something sensuous, which wasn't new to English poetry, but which had fallen away from the practice of most of the poets people read in the late 18th century. And one of the distinctions of Keats is that somehow, in a wholly new idiom that's close to conversation in some ways, he brings it back. The all-important poet of the age for Keats and for others of the, advanced spirits in literature of the time, the great figure of the previous generation was Wordsworth. And Keats, like others of his contemporaries, Shelley for one, Byron for another, had a very ambivalent regard to Wordsworth. He was the poet of nature. He was the poet who, even before his great poem, The Prelude, was known as the historian of the self. But Keats also cherished Wordsworth's originality as someone who had chosen what he called the mind of man as the main region of his song, and who spoke in all his poetry, but I'm picking a line out of one poem, Michael, of the pleasure which there is in life itself. Wordsworth recommended to his readers the joys of nothing supernatural. We were going to find our redemption, he said, not in Elysium subterranean fields or some secluded island, God knows where, but in the very world, which is the world of all of us, the world in which, in the end, we find our happiness or not at all. And that, I think, is a kind of touchstone of what Keats himself sought in poetry, and yet something he found missing in a great many ways in Wordsworth. He was displeased or saw the limitation of what he called Wordsworth's exploration of the mode of the egotistical sublime. Wordsworth, went too deep, too curiously, too narrowly into the reaches of himself, of his own mind, of his associations, of his peculiar affinities and experiences. And Keats wanted something broader that took him further back in the history of poetry to models like Spenser, whose diction he really never quite discards, and Milton, for the intensity of Milton's dedication to the longer forms. Hyperion was mentioned in the introduction a moment ago, and I'll quote, if I have time, a bit of The Fall of Hyperion. Keats wanted to produce, if he could, an epic that was not just about the self, that was not an instance of the egotistical sublime, but that looked back to Milton as its great exemplar. But he, at the same time, found himself dissatisfied as he looked over his own lines in this mode with what he called the surplus of Miltonic inversions. He was speaking poetic grammar in a way that didn't answer to people's common experiences in the London life he led. And he said, with some displeasure at Milton as a model and also displeasure at his own efforts along these lines, English ought to be kept up, meaning, the poetry has to have something to do with constant life, with life as we're feeling its experiences day to day. One thing people especially grow affectionate about regarding Keats, and even come to cherish, if you get deep enough into reading his poetry and prose, is his letters. They are fascinating letters to read, fascinating as a record of his aspirations and his developing ideas of aesthetic value, and his struggle to work out a poetry that was separate from the merely fanciful, adventurous, quasi-epic work, some of it associated with dream experience, that he would have thought himself to have derived from the poetry of Spenser, most of all, and perhaps from a near contemporary such as Coleridge. Keats came to define himself not only by opposition to the egotistical sublime, but by growth away from any such antique, fanciful, somehow not of this world poetry, and came to want more a poetry that spoke of sensuous experiences, often erotic experiences, the life of the senses in this world, and the yearnings, often unsatisfied, of people in this world. It's why these poems written by a young man have been especially an object of attachment for the young, but I don't think he speaks just for youth or the moods of youth. So I'm going to go to a later sonnet, in fact, one of his greatest, and it is quite late, the one called Bright Star, just to show how far he had come from the age of 21 or so to the age of 24 when he wrote this later piece. Bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art, not in lone splendor hung aloft the night, and watching with eternal lids apart, like nature's patient, sleepless eremite, the moving waters at their priest-like task of pure ablution round earth's human shores, or gazing on the new soft fallen mask of snow upon the mountains and the moors. No, yet still steadfast, still unchangeable, pillowed upon my fair love's ripening breast, to feel forever its soft fall and swell, awake forever in a sweet unrest, still to hear her tender taken breath, and so live ever, or else swoon to death. Some of the language here is antique, is learned, the patient, sleepless eremite, the priest-like task of pure ablution. But there are other touches, like the phrase immediately following, round earth's human shores, that are so original, one can't find words for them except to say, that is pure Keats. And when you get from the octave, the first 8 lines of the poem, to the last 6, the sestet, you're struck by the grammatical, syntactical, the linguistic virtuosity of it. He has managed to make this all one utterance, all virtually one sentence, a long sigh, and like the human expression that we could connect with the sigh, it is at once of loss and preservation. There is sadness in it, and there's continued learning, and there is satisfaction at the same time, watching his love sleep and clinging to the vision, to the sense of her tender taken breath. And this seems to him to give the highest feeling for life, and it is at such a moment, if one had to die, that one would die, or else swoon to death. I feel as if I've been a little adolescent in describing this poem, but it is a marvelous poem, and I think you feel its originality in every line of its one long breath. Of his letters, I thought I would read just 3 samples to give a solid impression, at least, of the quality of thinking that went into Keats's idealism about poetry, and in particular, the kind of poetry he knew that he, John Keats, uniquely wanted to create. The first letter concerns his ideas about beauty and what our consciousness of beauty implies about our relation to the world. It's a letter to Benjamin Bailey of November 1817. And he says there, I am certain of nothing but of the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of imagination. What the imagination seizes as beauty must be truth, whether it existed before or not. For I have the same idea of all our passions as of love. They are all in their sublime, creative of essential beauty. And he goes on a bit later. The imagination may be compared to Adam's dream. He awoke and found it truth. That's right out of Paradise Lost, where Adam dreams of a mate, dreams of someone like Eve, and awakes and she's there. I'm the more zealous in this affair because I've never been able to perceive how anything can be known for truth by mere consecutive reasoning. This consideration has further convinced me, for it has come as auxiliary to another favorite speculation of mine, that we shall enjoy ourselves here on earth after, excuse me, I fluffed that. We shall enjoy ourselves hereafter, he spells it as two words, by having what we called happiness on earth repeated in a finer tone, and so repeated. And yet, such a fate can only befall those who delight in sensation rather than hunger, as you do, he says to his correspondent, after truth. And it recalls a line from a different letter where Keats has said, oh, for a life of sensations rather than of thought. What does he mean by sensation? It is, I think, an effort to recall to us a life of experience, which bad works of art, which the monotony of daily life can conceal from us, like a crust that we have to break through. Sensations are something primitive, but going back to them through a work of art, they are the path to beauty. At least that is Keats's hope. And so the imagination may be compared to Adam's dream of someone he could love. He awoke and found it true. I'll read next a famous letter, maybe his most famous, and something that has outlived its context and been talked of in every field of endeavor, from foreign policy to the philosophy of science. And this is his note to his brothers, George and Thomas Keats, about, again, his aspirations. And he speaks of a moment where several things dovetailed in my mind. And at once it struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean, negative capability. That is, when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. This, pursued through volumes, would perhaps take us no further than this, that with a great poet, the sense of beauty overcomes every other consideration, or rather obliterates all consideration. So the central phrase, as you'll all have recognized, is that one about negative capability. And it can seem as almost self-contradictory. Capability means energy to do things. Negative seems to work by subtraction. But he means the power to hold oneself apart from the irritables, the everyday pains, the recurrent experiences and demands of life that take up most of life, whether we like it or not. Somehow, the mood of poetic composition at its height, the mood of imagination, has to be able to exist apart from that. It has to be negatively capable of working on something of its own. Not that the materials are all its own, but the project is its own. That does not react in reflexive response to the stimuli that we are used to responding to. So this idea of negative capability becomes almost synonymous for Keats with originality, with the spirit of something in a person that can lead to the production of something new, and he would like to have thought beneficial to human life. And finally, the letter on what he calls soul making. And that phrase, soul making, has a religious sound, but I think you'll see that Keats isn't religious in any common sense of the idea. When he says that, his idea of paradise is to have what we experience on earth repeated in a finer tone and so repeated. That's his idea of an afterlife, a hereafter, as he spells it in 2 words. So here's this later passage from what year are we in now? Not far from the last of these selections I have. This is May 1819. So, just about a year from his death. The common cognomen of this world among the misguided and superstitious is a veil of tears from which we are to be redeemed by a certain arbitrary interposition of God and taken to heaven. And he comments, what a little circumscribed, straitened notion. Call the world, if you please, the veil of soul making. Then you will find out the use of the world. I'm speaking now in the highest terms for human nature, admitting it to be immortal, which I will here take for granted for the purpose of showing a thought which has struck me concerning it. I say soul making as distinguished from intelligence, and he goes on to make 1 or 2 in his private train of thought, pedantic distinctions there. But what's interesting in the phrases I've just read to you is the way he speaks of human nature as immortal. It's not a single life that should be led to expect a hereafter, but human nature. There's something that passes from person to person. And to have an original spark, to be equipped by experience and by even the frictions of life to gain a soul, that seems to him the point of life. That is what it means to add something to life. And how is that done? He asks, how, but by the medium of a world like this. And the train of thought concludes, do you not see how necessary a world of pains and troubles is to school an intelligence and make it a soul? And I will confess, just personally, I find that an inspiring train of thought. Just to say, our spiritual self, whatever is higher than our mere empirical bodily self, if we think there is such a thing, comes from the life we live. It is developed, it is not given. And it is not a gift that you're going to receive at the end of life, either through proper works or through the automatic interposition of a God, an idea for which Keats expresses some contempt. A soul is something that grows through life and grows, as he says in another letter, from contest with circumstance. So he becomes, in his letters, arguing with himself in front of his friends to whom he sends them and his family, he becomes a poet of personal identity, of individual experience, and of, in some idealizing outworks of his poetry, a poet of the way experience can be translated into art, into something impersonal. And I think this is the subject, both his idealization of art as something that sublimates and transcends or transforms or translates human experience, but also art as something strange and perplexing for someone like Keats, who admires great artists, to think hard about. And he puts his idealism and his doubts into a poem that I think is not his most consistent or maybe most finally accomplished or satisfying, but is certainly his most intensely inquiring poem. And I think because it addresses the puzzle about art at this depth, it's become a touchstone for a great many people outside the field of literature, and that is the Ode on a Grecian Urn. Go straight to it. And I'm not going to read all of it. I think this audience probably knows the poem, and many of you have taught the poem, and some of you have probably taught it recently. But I want to focus on stanzas that do reflect this mood of a troubled mind about the status of works of art, and yet a need to cherish, to hold as everlasting, if such a thing could be, the object that has been created by the artist, the dead object created by a living person. So here is Keats in the second stanza of the poem, describing what he sees on the urn. And it's, of course, men chasing maidens, but never quite attaining the goal of the embrace that they want. Heard melodies are sweet, he says, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore, ye soft pipes, play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared, pipe to the spirit, ditties of no tone. Fair youth beneath the trees, thou canst not leave thy song, nor ever can those trees be bare. Bold lover, never, never canst thou kiss, though winning near the goal, yet do not grieve. She cannot fade, though thou hast not thy bliss, forever wilt thou love, and she be fair. So this is life at its most intense, at its most sensually energetic, caught frozen at a moment where it stops living, but by the same token can never die. And that paradox interests him throughout the poem. And so in the following stanza, ah, happy, happy boughs that cannot shed your leaves nor ever bid the spring adieu. And happy melodist, unwearied, forever piping songs forever new. More happy love, more happy, happy love, forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever panting and forever young, all breathing human passion far above, that leaves a heart high, sorrowful and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue. So there you see, I think, that the tension between this wish for a static immortality and the feeling of desperate, never-ending love for life as it's lived, the impasse he reaches between those two separate feelings. And there's a kind of panting, I think, even in the sound of this stanza and the way you have to say it, happy, happy love, forever panting and forever young. I mean, you would like to be forever young, but you might want to be rescued from being forever panting. And you wouldn't want to have the fever forever, but if the fever is a partial symptom of the warmth of love, who would do without that? He can't decide, I think, at this point in the poem. And he can't decide even on the meaning of a line like, all breathing human passion far above. Is the urn above human passion? But it's good to be breathing. It's not good to be dead with no breath. So the poem tries to pull together an admirable and sentiment about art worth preserving with its final stanza on truth, and beauty. And remember, that's a train of thought Keats had worked out already in that letter on Adam's dream. What the imagination seizes as beauty must be truth. So he addresses the urn, "O Attic shape, fair attitude, with breed of marble, men and maidens overwrought, with forest branches and the trodden weed. Thou, silent form, dost tease us out of thought, as doth eternity, cold pastoral. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know." Well, this has become one of the most interpreted and over-interpreted, with overwrought interpretations, poems in the canon of English poetry. And what kind of reassurance Keats means to spell out in that last inscription formula is one of the points that commentators argue about. I think the important persistence of that trouble of mind that I spoke of to keep in view is what you see face on in the line, "Thou dost tease us out of thought, as doth eternity, cold pastoral." That phrase, cold pastoral, is a fascinating, a resonant, strange, and wonderful pair of words, because pastoral comforts. It is a religious term of comfort. And of course, it also has literary reference to a certain mode of poetry Keats no longer wanted to explore. But if eternity teases us out of thought, and Keats means out of irritable thoughts, this is close to the idea of negative capability. But the artist who has been removed from the irritables, from the pains of life, has also been removed from life itself. He's cold, he's out cold. And of course, to choose an urn, which can contain ashes in it, as the object of this address, intensifies, I think, that troubling quality of the questioning here of whether we want to think of art as something better than life. So there's questioning, but I'm not one of those critics who would want to say that Keats means ironically or entirely distrusts or wants to show us the error of the last words, "Beauty is truth, truth beauty." I can't prove that Keats meant those lines sincerely, in earnest, but I think one has to consult one's own experience of works of art. And since he talks about music, about sound, even before he talks about picture, about visual representation in this poem, it's interesting to think what our feelings are about melodies, about great songs that come back to us. We don't know why. That, as it were, as the American phrase now goes, have taken up residence rent-free in our minds. It's a strange thing, but I would ask rhetorically, who has not felt that some melody, whether from a Beethoven sonata or a hard bop blues number by Horace Silver, that just was there, that the artist saw something that dropped down as if from another region, from our own region, repeated in a finer tone, that noticed thing of beauty, which, though it was noticed by the artist's mind, has been created by the artist, that was meant to be, that it's part of the truth of human feeling now, that it's part of what makes human nature immortal, as Keats said. I think that's the sentiment underlying beauty is truth, truth beauty. Or as one sometimes says, looking at a portrait in an art gallery, in a museum, or reading a poem, or even, I would say, reading a great oration that has the quality of eloquence that can move over generations. Somebody might say, boy, he really nailed it, or she really got it there. This is a sentiment that Rebecca West talks about in an essay about art called The Strange Necessity. And I think Keats has the same feeling of truth as something captured by an artist, but it's a kind of truth that doesn't connect with any other meaning of the word. Let me skip, I think, a passage I was going to read from his unfinished epic, The Fall of Hyperion, itself the revision of his unfinished epic, Hyperion. And just remind you, as was already said, that Keats contracted tuberculosis, very possibly from nursing his brother Tom, who died of it, and went to recover for climate to Italy, took up residence in a small apartment near the Spanish Steps, and is buried now in the Protestant cemetery in Rome. And that his inscription, at his desire, reads, "Here lies one whose name is writ in water." And that is it's an extraordinary thing to want to have inscribed on one's tombstone, because it means that one's life is as evanescent as one of the elements, but also that one's self, Keats's self as a poet too, has come together with, flowed into the same stream as the poetry of earth that he was writing about in that poem about the cricket and the grasshopper. And he, for all his feeling of thwarted aspiration of dying too young, did say in a letter near the end of his life, "I think I shall be among the English poets after my death." And that wish, with so little else fulfilled to his satisfaction in life, that wish has come true. You know, if Keats were a presider over us who still could look down on the living, as he never would have wanted to, he would have found that, you know, like Adam's dream, his fame is a thing that he awoke and found it true. I think I'll stop there. Actually, I'll do one more thing. It seemed to me, since we're commemorating the 200th anniversary of Keats's death, and I chose the title 1821 to 2021 to you know, parenthetically give some specific notation to what I wanted to do in this talk. I thought I should include some evidence of Keats as a still living force in the work of later poets, poets who would not have written as they did, or certainly would not have written some pieces as they did, without Keats as a major influence for whom they were grateful. And I picked this poem, an autumn poem, but it's a New England autumn poem, late autumn, by Robert Frost. Keats's ode to autumn is probably, to modern taste, and especially to modern scholarly taste, the greatest of his late odes. And this poem by Frost doesn't emulate Keats's ode to autumn at all, but in its sense of the luxury and sensuous pleasure to be taken in ordinary things, and in, if you will, the poetry of earth, living things and vegetable things, it is absolutely Keatsian. It's a lovely little poem. It's very early Frost. If Keats hadn't lived, Frost would never have written this. So I'll read it to you and then I'll stop. And I'm reading it from New England, so perhaps I sentimentalize the atmosphere a bit. "Oh, hushed October morning mild, thy leaves have ripened to the fall. Tomorrow's wind, if it be wild, should waste them all. The crows above the forest call, tomorrow they may form and go. Oh, hushed October morning mild, begin the hours of this day slow. Make the day seem to us less brief. Hearts not averse to being beguiled, beguile us in the way you know. Release one leaf at break of day. At noon, release another leaf. One from our trees, one far away. Retard the sun with gentle mist. Enchant the land with amethyst. Slow, slow, for the grape's sake, if they were all, whose leaves already are burnt with frost, whose clustered fruit must else be lost, for the grape's sake along the wall. And I'm going to stop there, and I would be glad to speak with anyone who wants to talk about Keats.
Thank you, sir, for that enriching lecture.
It is now time to move on to the Q&A session. Michelle and I would be reading out questions simultaneously. Sir, in case you are unable to hear us due to any sort of technical issues or lack of clarity, do let us know. We will repeat the question for you.
Sir, the first question is from Mr. Jose Thomas. Does Eliot's etherized patient on table owe anything to Keats' eternal lids apart, nature's patient, sleepless eremite?
Eliot's patient etherized upon a table, was that the comparison? I didn't get the first part. Was it T.S. Eliot's patient
Yes,
etherized
sir.
upon a table?
Yes,
Yes?
sir.
Yes, yes.
I don't think so. And Eliot's is a kind of, deliberately repellent trick line. There's so Eliot. It really comes at a later phase of poetry, and he's, I would say, there's no such thing as opposites or exact similarities in poetry, in the arts. But Eliot is of a temperament almost the reverse of Keats. He is, in many ways, as ironic and anti-physical a poet, especially in his early work, as there has been in English. And I think the prototype for a line like that, the patient etherized upon a table, comes out of French poetry, comes out most of all out of Baudelaire, whom Eliot admired greatly and would have been reading much more than Keats at the time he wrote it. What Eliot is doing in that line, second line of the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, is confessing, as it were, by a kind of trickster, grotesque attitude, by a parody, how impossible it is to write a line of poetry about a sunset anymore, or to write about the sky anymore, because it's been so done to death by Romantic poets and by the much more second-hand, second-rate poetry that followed them in the later 19th century. So, it relates to the kind of practice Keats is engaging in with great originality. But I think there's no pleasure in Eliot's line. It's meant to induce a sense of a bit of revulsion, disgust, wonder, a wonder at what's coming next. And though you could say it's something that goes through the mind of Prufrock, I think that line, is a bravura performance by Eliot going outside the speaker of the poem. I don't think Prufrock thought that line either. So it's a very theoretical line to have written. And I think Keats was never, pulling tricks like that in his poetry. Do you want me to read from the chat things as they appear, or would you like to deliver the?
Divya, Michelle, would you please read the question?
Yes, sir. The next question is from Jagrati Ubadhyaya. The question is, Louise MacNeilbert calls Keats a mystic through the medium of the senses. Why mystic? I request you to elaborate.
Well, maybe because he works out his private fables or almost theology in passages of his letters, such as that one I read about the veil of soul making. And he does see himself as someone given a unique glimpse of the sufferings of humanity, the sufferings even of the dead gods, the Titans, when he's working out his relationship to the priestess Moneta in Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion. So, I mean, Keats certainly does feel he has a special relation to the vision of humanity. But I think of the mystics, if we think of Jacob Boehme or any example you like, as speculative religious thinkers so far outlying from the edge of any religious orthodoxy that we don't know what description to give them, but they are dedicated to a life not of this world. Whereas Keats is, as he says again and again, altogether of this world. His name is written in water. And so I wouldn't, the rest of that description seems apt, but I wouldn't use the word mystic about Keats.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Abita. Keats sounds like Hamlet's double, his spiritual brother. Can you please share your views on this?
Well, you know, there was the fascination with the character of Hamlet that we in the 20th or 21st century perhaps take for granted did begin in Keats's, in the generation just before Keats, the generation of half a generation before, of Coleridge, of Hazlitt, of Leigh Hunt, of the Romantic critics, because Hamlet is the paradigmatic instance of self-questioning as a character in literature, and what to say, a character in a dramatic format who somehow bursts through it and declares himself as an individual and sometimes seems lyrical. Though Hamlet doesn't seem anything for very long. He is the most changeable of characters. So I mean, I think that could be a reason why someone would feel there's a strong affinity between Keats and Hamlet. Keats's annotations on Shakespeare, which are not hard to find, they're probably even online now, are, you know, also offer great insights into the way he thought about poetry and imagination. And I've read them, but I don't recall from his annotations to the plays any particular remarks about Hamlet, and that may be just my forgetting. But in that general way, I think it is we who are Hamlet. You know, critics of that age, and then the German critics of the next age will say again and again. And this wouldn't be a sentimental picture of Hamlet, but Hamlet as the typical man of mind struggling with circumstance. So, I mean, I think it's a common sentiment at the time, but I don't think especially intense for Keats.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Vimal John. Are there any Freudian or psychoanalytic attempts at engaging with the idea of the melancholic romantic?
Oh gosh, there are many, so many that I don't know which to list first. You know, there's an ancient, by now, book from 75 years ago by Mario Prats called The Romantic Agony, which has some Freudian knowledge in it. But, you know, psychoanalytic discussions of Romanticism were quite common at the time when I was in graduate school and for a few years after. Freud had things to say about human ambivalence and the formation of the mind against contests with the father or with previous minds or with previous generations. In the case of a book like Totem and Taboo or Civilization, Its Discontents, that are, you know, that seem to me so profound that they apply to the arts generally and therefore apply to Keats in particular. But I think I won't say more about that because it hasn't been a walk of commentary I've explored much. It's very possibly Professor Culler would give a better response to that question, and you can ask him when he gives his lecture.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Ayan Khan. Keats' poems reflect his personal circumstances. Death was always a part of his life. To what extent do Keats' poems reflect his awareness of mortality and the transitory nature of life?
Well, that's what his poems are about. The existence of people in time, the necessity of mortality to our understanding of beauty. I mean, that is a line, a touchstone line, if you will, from the Ode on Melancholy. She dwells with beauty, beauty that must die. A line that is practically paraphrased by Wallace Stevens in his poem Sunday Morning, when he writes, "Death is the mother of beauty." That's a Keatsian sentiment, and he is above all that. He is the poet of earth and of the passing life of earth, and how it is to be cherished just for that reason. I think he felt that Wordsworth's borderline supernatural sublimities were a kind of betrayal, suggested a sort of faithlessness about the life of earth, which Wordsworth had deeply lived and had explored like no one else in poetry. And Keats wanted to make that commitment, that a secular, if you will, commitment of poetry, honest in the kind of work he did.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Sunny. Being aware of death close at hand, Keats' preoccupation with the world of senses was a way of making up for the short time he had. Would you agree?
Yes, very much so. But the only thing I'd add is we should distrust diagrams of a poet's career that assume that they know when they're going to die, or they know when their career is over, and so their last poems pronounce the greatest truth which they always had in view and were working up to. That would be to take a teleological view of a poet's life, and teleology seems to me, that is to say, knowing a predetermined end and everything being directed toward that end. That seems to me no more honest as an approach to a poet's life than it is to anyone else's. But it's certainly true that Keats, for many months before he died, and while he was still writing poetry, and some of his greatest poetry, did know that there was a strong chance that he would die. And so the passion of those late poems, and you might even feel he's got a premonition of it in the Ode on a Grecian Urn, owes something to the sense of himself perhaps being fated to die young.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Yasid Bahas. Why Keats is called a romantic poet, although he didn't write in love poems?
Oh, well, that's a different meaning of the word romantic, and it's what to say, a transfer of meaning that I see in a lot of young scholars in America too. So, I mean, we talk about romantic love with a small r, as the feeling of being carried away, of not knowing how strong your feelings were, but it's as if something out of yourself is acting in relation to someone else. That sense of romantic love, and Keats did write romantic poems. To Fanny Braun in the sonnet beginning, when the night is gone and all its sweets are gone. Lamia has a kind of disappointed romantic poem, and there's others. But you got to keep in mind the three somewhat distinct meanings of romantic. One is that sense of uncontrolled, passionate love. And then there's the idea of romance, sometimes capitalized, which refers to, the artistic world of chivalric allegory, for example, such as the Fairy Queen. But it also refers more closer to Keats's time to, say, the novels of Walter Scott, which made romance, if you will, made fanciful stories out of King Arthur and the Round Table and other older topics. So romance tends to refer to something fanciful at a distance, often at a distance in time. And then there is romanticism, and that's a later invention. No artistic movement has ever named itself, and usually they are named by their antagonists. The Transcendentalists didn't in America, the American Romantics, Emerson, Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, etc. They did not call themselves Transcendentalists. Their enemies called them that. But the name took because it seemed to express some aspiration that they held in common. And the Romantic poets, when does that, as Keats would have called it, cognomen, when does that nickname come in? I think it's late 19th century when you have collectors like William Michael Rossetti starting to go back to Blake, go back to Keats, and see that the first and second generation of great Romantic poets have something in common, and that there is this new adventurousness of fancy. But Keats is classified, if you want to call it that, as a Romantic poet, capital R, in that sense of being part of a movement which involved a radical departure from previous poetic practice. And in the case of all the Romantic poets, some of the time, and of at least, all of them except Wordsworth and Coleridge, right to the end of their careers, also involved a commitment to political radicalism in the generation after the French Revolution.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Shaukat Ali. How Keats, been highly sensual, modify his concept of imagination as compared to Wordsworth and Coleridge, or from other Romantics?
Well, Coleridge is a horribly repressed sensualist, and it comes out, in a poem like Christabel. But I think it comes out even in the sensuous, to a last degree, landscape of Kubla Khan. And in other poems. Coleridge is a most unhappy, deeply sensual poet who is watched over by an internal censor that gives him no happiness. That's my view, anyway. Wordsworth is a pagan, as he pretty much calls himself in one of his sonnets. But he at the same time, rather disapproves of his own inward radicalism. And so there's a kind of dialogue between one aspect of Wordsworth and another that makes him, often disappointing for his failure to live up to his own impulses, so to speak. Keats, the one time they met, at a dinner presided over by the artist Benjamin Robert Hayden, Keats was young Keats asked to read out loud to middle-aged Wordsworth his Hymn to Pan, which is a piece of his long poem Endymion. And after hearing it, Wordsworth pronounced, "A pretty piece of paganism, Mr. Keats." Extraordinarily, it's a put down at the same time that it's a compliment, but it's a very prudish remark. And I think this officiousness, that's one element of Wordsworth, not the most genuine, but I think that has to be taken into account when you think of Wordsworth and Coleridge. But they are, ultimately, they are sensuously revealing poets to the last degree. They live in the physical world and teach readers to love it. Keats is unembarrassed by that. Keats is frankly a lover of daily and sensuous things. And I think that's when I said he is perhaps of these difficult poets, he is the first that a young person can come to admire. And I think that's true of the development of many readers who start relatively early with poetry. A precocious young man or woman of 14 or 15 can begin to have deep feelings about a good deal of Keats's poetry. And I don't think that is very often true of people's contact with, say, Wordsworth, or at the other end of an emotional continuum, or Byron. They're too. They don't touch the emotions of the young. Keats does, and I think it's that very directness of contact with physical experience and with unprotected emotions.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Divyansh Bhatt. It is a long question. Perhaps most of traditional criticism on Keats has tried to divorce him and his poetry from politics. However, I would like to make a different case over here. Keats, if not more, but as political as the other poets. His attempt to study classics, Greek, and his inclusion of Hellenistic imagery in his poetry not only make him a subversive force within the erstwhile poetic circle that was mostly dominated by well-read Oxbridge-educated men, but also his ideas, such as that of negative capability, hold equally political significance even in the contemporary world. Please comment on this.
I agree. And what should I say? I already agreed. I wrote an article, it's now 30 years ago or so, called Keats's Radicalism. That was part of a special issue of an American scholarly journal called Studies in Romanticism. So, I mean, that questioner is even more right than the question says. Keats thought of himself as a radical, identified himself with the advance in human nature that he associated with the French Revolution. But it's a mistake to think that the literary milieu in which Keats moved was dominated by Oxbridge personalities. I couldn't tell if the question was saying that or not. But Keats was denounced, was raked over by Tory critics as one of what they called the Cockney school, and that included critics, a poet and critic and newspaper editor like Leigh Hunt. It included Hazlitt, it included John Hamilton Reynolds among Keats's correspondents, and many others. And these were young men of London, many of them of no particular means, but making their way. The proper analogy, well, I don't want to give a pop music analogy, but you can think of your own if you go back to the 60s. Keats moved in that kind of circle, and he did have political beliefs and wasn't backward about professing them. Where does it come out most? There's a poem called Isabella, or the Pot of Basil, which has a passage on money and the use of money by factory owners that is as radical as anything in the works of Marx. And one of the first commentators to say so was George Bernard Shaw, who commented on that passage in Isabella. So it's in his poetry as well. But allowing that and agreeing completely with the questioner, I would not want to say Keats is mainly a political poet. That would just be a distortion. The kind of freedom he wants has political value and political significance. I think that's the way to say it.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Thomas PJ. Did Keats have affinity for death? Did he bring death on himself? Did he want to make his misfortune into poetry consciously?
That question, I think, is asking, was Keats right? What was Keats morbid? Did he embrace death? The closest you could find for evidence of that in his poetry, I suppose, would be the Ode on Melancholy, which was a favorite of the decadent poets of the 1890s. They are poets like Ernest Dowson and Oscar Wilde are constantly echoing, particularly that one of the odes. And they found Keats's closeness to death to be something delicious and fascinating. I don't think it's true of Keats himself from my reading of his letters and the biographies of him that I have read. And I mean, if the closest he came to bringing on death would have been the time he spent with his tubercular brother. But I think that would involve a distortion of his very probable motives. Remember, Keats trained to be an apothecary. He wanted to assist human life. And in the passage from, I think I'll go to that for a second, if you don't mind. I'll try to share and go to that passage from the Fall of Hyperion, because when he confronts the priestess who has charge over his poetic vision, and Keats asks, what do I owe this privilege of the vision, the mystic, if you will, vision that I'm about to be accorded? She tells him that being a poet is something less than being a real carer for humanity. It's a fascinating passage in light of that question, I think. Let me just go to it and you can watch it while I read it. Are there not thousands in the world, said I, encouraged by the sooth voice, that's the priestess, of the shade, who love their fellows even to the death, who feel the giant agony of the world, and more, like slaves to poor humanity, labor for mortal good, the way a doctor would, the way an apothecary would. I sure should see other men here, but I am here alone. And she replies, those whom thou spakest of are no visionaries, rejoined that voice. They are no dreamers weak. They seek no wonder but the human face, no music but a happy noted voice. They come not here. They have no thought to come. And art thou here? Excuse me. And thou art here, for thou art less than they. What benefit canst thou do, or all thy tribe, to the great world? And all thy tribe means poets. So Keats considered, I'm going to say it like this, someone who, if you will, medicines to others, someone who offers assistance, worldly assistance, bodily assistance to others. He considered them who seek no wonder but the human face better than poets. But the poet is special in his exposure to a world of pain. So I guess I reject, maybe too optimistically, maybe innocently, I reject as a bit morbid and improbable the idea that Keats wanted to bring death closer. But there is no doubt that though he thought the human face and human life was a higher thing than the special vision of the poet on the outskirts of life. He identified himself, even in that passage that I just read, as a poet, as somebody who was to that extent outside the circumference of ordinary life.
Thank you, sir. Now to the last question, and it is from Ashish Chetri. Can you shed some light on the message of the urn in Grecian Urn?
The message of the urn, beauty is. I tried to do that, maybe in a somewhat stumbling way. Beauty is truth, truth, beauty. A former colleague of mine, and before that, teacher of mine, Jeffrey Hartman, who wrote very well in 2 or 3 articles about inscriptions in poetry. And that's a major mode of late 18th century poetry. Wordsworth has a great many short and not so short poems in that line. Keats takes this up. I mean, beauty is truth, truth, beauty is that is all you know on earth and all you need to know, is what the urn seems to say as you turn it around. And what Hartman pointed out is that if you turn the urn around, beauty, truth, truth, beauty, it comes all the way around. It has that kind of satisfying circularity. I think that's a good aesthetic observation about the decorum of the poem at the end of it, but I'm not sure how far it goes to satisfy our interest in what Keats is actually saying. And the connection between beauty and a kind of truth. has its background in Palladian architecture, in talk about symmetry, right angles, lots of right angles being an element of beauty. I don't think Keats was so pedantic or foursquare in his understanding of the way beauty could be composed of constituent elements. And I don't think he's talking about poetry and science. I do think he's talking about the way that, what the imagination seizes as beauty must be truth. He says it that way in another place in his letters. The way that an astonishing momentary discovery, which is to me beauty, can strike me also as telling me something about the world, that has wider ramifications. That's beauty is truth. How truth can be beauty is, I think, a harder point. But I think that's a recognition about experience and the sum total of the counted pulses of experience that Keats would like to persuade himself of. That as life adds up, there is something of aesthetic satisfaction in the way we can regard it. But I would say, and this is just how the poem strikes me now, that beauty is truth is a proposition Keats believed. And he thought he had known it. He had recognized that from moments in his own life. Truth beauty is the thing he would like to persuade himself of, because it would make sense of poetry as a vocation. It would mean that he was linked with what he calls the march of intellect, with enlightenment and the opening up of the rights of man and so on. That should be beautiful too. We might say, in a very rough translation into political morale of the kind of difficulty he's dealing with, liberty is good. Everybody can see that. No liberty without equality. So equality is good as liberty. Oh, yes, that must be true. We want that to be true. We're going to argue ourselves into thinking that's true. But it's not, it's one thing maybe more intuitive than the other. And I think that's the difficulty around beauty is truth, beauty. But I think that probably I'm going to bring back science, having once dismissed it. I think that the idea that truth is beauty is an experience known to some people who make discoveries in, for example, physics or chemistry. And Keats uses a lot of chemical analogies when he's talking about the transformative power of imagination. So who knows, that may have been in the back of his mind too.
Thank you, sir. It's time for us to wind up our Q&A session. We received so many interesting questions today, but unfortunately, due to the lack of time, we will not be able to attend to all these questions. But we ensure you that all these questions will be directed towards the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you all for listening, and it's been a wonderful experience being able to talk to you.
Now I invite Mr. Amal Tomes, Assistant Professor, Department of English, St. Berchmans College, to propose a vote of thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Respected and the most distinguished speaker of the day, Professor David Bromwich. Chief guests of the day, Professor Jonathan Culler and Professor Akhil Bilgrami. Respected Principal Dr. Jacob Matthew, sir. Our beloved head of the department, PJ Thomas, sir. Convener of this Bicentenary Lecture Series, Father Jose Jacob. Honorable faculty members, teachers, research scholars, beloved students of SB College, and my dear participants from all sides of the planet. Warm greetings to you all from the Department of English, SB College. I deem it a great honor to address this intellectual gathering and propose the vote of thanks. First, I would like to propose a hearty vote of thanks to the main resource person of the day, Professor David Bromwich, for gracing today's session with such a thought-provoking and fetching lecture on the topic John Keats, Remarks and a Reading. He explained amply on how Keats, a man, as we know, half in love with equal death, kept his signature delightfully different from the rest of the second generation poets like Byron or Shelley for that matter. And it was indeed a pleasure listening to Professor Bromwich explaining Keats' poetry of earth while soaring high on the viewless wings of poesy into those cloudy bowers of romantic imagination. He did take us through some of Keats' celebrated poetry and took us closer to the idea of the romantic sublime, and while explaining how it culminated as essential poetic beauty in our author's poetry. And I must say, forever warm and still to be enjoyed. We all felt we couldn't get enough of you and your insights, sir. And I must add, I did receive both rhyme and reason this time. And just a glance at the chat box, inundated with the questions and appreciations alike, denotes how palpable was Professor Bromwich's lecture and how much it piqued the interest of the participants. So I thank you, sir, for being here, for answering our queries, and for that exceedingly beautiful session. Thank you, sir. I also thank Professor Akhil Bilgrami, who recently enlightened us with a special lecture as part of the Scholar in Residence program, and Professor Jonathan Culler, who is here, the Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Cornell University, the resource person for tomorrow's lecture, for their kind presence throughout. I take this opportunity to thank our principal, who besides his regular schedule found time to address not only this gathering, but numerous webinars and lecture series assisted by Father Jose that the Department of English conducted within these few months. We thank you, sir, for the felicitation. Also, I would like to place on record our indebtedness to our beloved head of the department, Professor P.J. Thomas, for his relentless support and guidance throughout the program. He enlivened the organizing team and made himself available whenever and wherever the team needed him. So I thank you, sir, for your generosity. Now, Father Jose Jacob, the convener of this event, richly deserves our gratitude, and on behalf of you all, I offer him the same. An ardent lover of poetry and a fine scholar, Father Jose is an exceptional teacher whom I must credit for instilling in me the love for poetry. Dear Father, we know how passionately you were involved with the various processes regarding the proper organization and execution of this program. So on behalf of the department, I congratulate you and offer our sincere appreciation of your industry and diligence. I'm also grateful to Dr. Vimal Mohan John and Professor Nitin Varghese, who worked behind the curtains and helped us manage the Q&A session exceptionally well. And I thank Professor Jaren B. Sebastian of our department, Mr. Dan of third BA Vocational English, and Mr. Giorgio Sebastian of the Department of Malayalam for their technical assistance and kind presence throughout. And I thank all other faculty members who have directly or indirectly helped with the proper organization of this program. I'm also happy to acknowledge our gratitude to the first term English students, Michelle and Divya, the hosts of today's event, who meticulously moderated the entire session, keeping the time frame intact. Thank you, Michelle and Divya. Finally, all our wonderful participants here who managed to spare some quality time with us and participated so actively in the session. We have received over 900 registrations, and we have more than 400 participants attending the lecture here in this Zoom platform, and a lot more watching them on YouTube. Students, teachers, and research scholars from various parts of the globe, and also participants from various known other academic fields. I take this opportunity to thank every one of them. Once again, I thank you all for your cordial cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
With that, we have come to the end of today's lecture.
The next lecture of John Keats' Bicentenary Lecture series will be conducted on 25th February 2021 at 7 p.m. Indian time, and the lecture will be headed by Professor Jonathan Culler on the topic Keats' Lyrical Poetry.
It was indeed a pleasure to have you among us today. Feedback forms are provided in the chat box. Once again, thank you for joining with us. Thank you.
No. Thank you, Professor Bromwich. Thank you. Professor Kala, see you day after tomorrow. Professor Akhil, thank you for attending.
So shall I close the meeting?
Yeah. Thank you all. Yeah.